Well, hey folks, I'm Josh. Welcome back to the shop. My little guy's birthday is coming up. He's going to be 3 here shortly. And I always like to try to make gifts when I can. And so I have raided my cut-offs bin, and I have some obscure pieces of wood here that I want to try to turn into, you've probably seen them, those little balancing wooden, I don't know, gems or jewels, kind of look like rocks maybe, where you just take a piece of wood and you put a bunch of facets on it so that they can be stacked on top of each other. And so I thought, well, I have plenty of wood that's left over from all kinds of projects, so we could make a whole bunch of those. So I'm going to try this in a bunch of different ways. I know you could, you could do it with a belt sander, you could do it with a chisel, you could do it with a saw, you could make these in all kinds of different ways. So I'm going to try, I don't know, all of them, and maybe give my feedback on which one works best, or at least which works best for me. So probably one of the most obvious ways of doing this is with the belt sander. So this is my oscillating belt sander, but I think any belt sander would probably work, even if you had just a normal handheld belt sander that you clamped in a bench vise or something like that. And I think as you're going, you probably want to try to keep at least a couple of parallel surfaces so that they stack, maybe even if they're not perfectly parallel, but close, because otherwise the kid's gonna have a hard time stacking them, which is kind of part of the point. So on this one, I'm gonna try it with this little block. This is a piece of oak, and it'll probably take a little bit, but it's not a huge block, so hopefully I should be able to add some facets and make this interesting. So here we go. Now I've got a chunk of cherry I'm going to work on, and this one I'm going to see how much damage I can do with a chisel. Alright, so I feel like I have exhausted most of what I can do on this with a chisel without getting more creative with my work holding. So I thought we'd see if we can maybe do a little more with the plane. Alright, now we're going to try on a piece of, I suppose this is pine or Douglas fir or something. I don't know. It's a little offcut from a 2x4. And we're going to do some knife work. And so I'm using this because it's softer. I don't really want to use the knife on a hard piece of cherry or oak or something. So we'll see how the knife works on this softer wood. All right, so this next one I'm going to work on, this is a piece of ash, and I think I'm going to try to do it with a back saw. I have a small one here and a little bit bigger one, and I have an even bigger yet if I need it. But we're going to try to do some facets on here with the saw, and then I have a feeling I'm going to want to clean it up on the belt sander when I'm done, but at least I can do the majority of the wood removal here, hopefully. So let's see how that works. I just have a little backstop clamped into the vise here so that I can have something to hold against as I cut. This is a piece of olive wood root burl that I'm going to use. Hopefully I'm going to use the bandsaw to get some of the facets cut into this one. When using a bandsaw on small parts, you want to have flat surfaces in contact with the saw surface all the way up to the blade so that you don't, it doesn't snag and rip down, and you can break your blade and kink your blade, or pull your fingers into it or whatever. So you want to be careful about that. And since that's not always going to be possible on some of these facets, I'm going to employ this wooden clamp and hopefully be able to get some kind of unique angles, because I'll be using it on the surface to hold the piece. So we'll see if I can make that work out a little bit. If you don't have a belt sander or a circular sander or something like that, you could maybe do your sanding with a handheld sander of some type, like a random orbital or something like that, but it's going to be really hard to maintain really flat surfaces for your facets with one of those. At least for me it is. So if you don't have a belt sander or a circular sander, some sanding machine with a nice flat surface that you can reference to, this is maybe the next best step. And this would just be, hand sanding. And all I have here is a strip of 220 sandpaper. And I'm going to hand sand this block, partially just to show it, but also because this is Purple Heart and my belt sander is just burning it. The belt on my belt sander is fairly worn, and I don't actually have another one on hand. So I'm just getting burns, and you can kind of see it's blackened in the corners and stuff. So for the sake of demoing hand sanding, and also just so that I can still use this, I don't want it to be all black. So I'll sand this on there. So when it comes to hand sanding, you want to make sure you got your sandpaper on a nice flat surface. And I could adhere this to something or something like that with like a spray adhesive, but this works for me. It's good enough. So this is just a piece of 220 clipped down to my bench top. And when you're doing your sanding on the small surfaces, it's probably easier to establish your angle. It's kind of like sharpening, actually. Establish your angle and then just pull back, because if you go back and forward, you're more likely to rock on the small facets, and you'll be more likely to get rounded edges. Whereas on like these big flat surfaces, you can go back and forth because you're not going to rock on that as much. But like on this one, if I was to go back and forth, I know I would round the edges. So it works better to just do one direction. As far as the sanding goes, how high a grit would you want to go? I think 220 is a pretty optimal grit. If you go too much smoother than that, the blocks get hard to stack because they're so smooth that they're almost glassy and they don't have any grip on top of each other. So 220 is nice because it gives a good look, and then it still has enough texture that the blocks will still sit on top of each other fairly well, even at a little bit of an angle. So I think 220 works as a good point, but you may want to go a little higher, a little lower, whatever works for you. So one of the things you're going to want to do before you put a finish on these is you're going to want to knock off any of the sharp edges. This is a piece of bird's eye maple that really took some nice facets, but the edges are so pointy that I'm afraid someone might hurt themselves, especially if they were used as a projectile, which, if you're like me and you got two boys, always a possibility. So just a fine piece of sandpaper, and you just a couple quick passes on the sharper corners, and I'm just going kind of by feel here and just rounding those edges just a little bit. I still want them to look sharp, but I don't want them to feel sharp, essentially. All right, a quick tour of the different techniques I used before finish. So I might touch some of these up a little bit before I put a finish on, but I wanted to show you what they look like before I touch them up. So the first one I did was this one. This is a piece of oak that I did purely on the belt sander. It was it was about this size of a cutoff, and I didn't use any saw or anything. I just did it on the belt sander, and it worked. If you were going to use just a belt sander, if that was the only tool you had available to you was a sander, you would want to make sure you had a good fresh belt on it with a pretty good grit, because it takes a long time to get through some of this wood by hand, just by sanding. It's definitely quicker if you can do some form of cutting before you start sanding, because it'll go faster and it's easier on your sanding belt. But it is effective. You just got to be careful about burning your wood. So that's just the sander. The next thing I did was using a chisel and a combination of planes, hand planes, and that worked out pretty well. The only real trick with doing that is holding it. It's such a small piece of wood, and part of that's because I chose such a small piece. If I had done it with a bigger one, it might have been easier. Your work holding is challenging. So a vise or a combination of like a clamp and a vise kind of thing works out, and you get a pretty nice finish. Of course, if you got nice sharp tools, you get great finishes off of planes. and chisels. This is not this has not been sanded. I just took some of the corners off a little bit with some sandpaper, and so you got some nice edges on there. And that's a piece of cherry. The next one I did, and this is just a piece of 2x4 that just a cutoff that I did purely with a knife. No sanding. I didn't even sand the edges on this one, and that's just with a knife, or a couple of knives, I suppose. But it's kind of neat in that you get a little bit of a, trying to see if you can see it. Yeah, the surface is not, because I didn't make nice long straight cuts, you get this little bit of a texture to the surface, which is kind of neat. But you also, at least with a 2x4, because it's such a soft wood, even with my sharp knife on the end grain, I end up with a little bit of a crushed, the fibers crush and tear a little bit, so it's hard to get a really nice finish on the end grain on a 2x4. Had I chosen a better piece of wood, you could have done this, but it takes a long time. It's a pretty slow process if you're just doing it with a knife. But it's doable. Next up, hand saw, and then belt sander finished. I just used a hand saw. I used a back saw, and get nice cool cuts. And the belt sander, you kind of have to do some kind of sanding after with the hand saw, because you just have such rough saw marks in there that you're not going to enjoy how that looks. And this is a piece of ash. It's got a little bit of spalting in the end there. You can see some color and uniqueness going on there. But that worked out pretty well. And then I'll talk about bandsaw and hand sand. And hand sanding, of course, only if you don't have a mechanical sander available to you. Or, like this piece, you get burn marks because this is Purple Heart and it's so hard and it's hard to sand. And my belt's kind of worn out, so you can still see a little bit of a burn there from when I was trying to do it on the belt sander. So then I switched over to hand sanding, and it works out. It just takes a while. And you just have to make sure you maintain nice flat pulls or back and forths so that you don't round over your edges. And last but not least, probably my favorite method of doing this was with a bandsaw and then using the belt sander after that. So I did maybe 10 more of these, and all of those I used the bandsaw to make the cuts and then the belt sander to finish them off. So this is a piece of olive wood. It's from an olive tree, but it's from the root ball. So it's kind of a unique grain pattern from that root ball, left over from a piece a buddy gave me. And so that's a pretty fast technique. And the trick there is, again, holding that piece safely, because if you're trying to hold a small piece by hand and push it through the bandsaw, that can get really sketchy, and I don't recommend it if you don't have a nice flat contact, of course. So the real trick to that is, what I found, is getting yourself one of these, or having one of these clamps. These work great because you don't always have to have a parallel surface to clamp to. If you have something that's a little bit not quite parallel, a little bit softer jaws, and because they can be set at kind of odd angles, this really worked well to hold the piece while I pushed it through the bandsaw. So I did all the rest of these with the bandsaw, and then I put them on the belt sander for just a little bit to smooth off the saw marks. So that was my favorite by far. I'm sure you could figure out a jig to do this on the table saw. Definitely don't try to hand hold on the table saw. That's a great way to lose a finger or a hand, or worse. So if you try to do this with a table saw, be really careful. I'm sure there are jigs available that could do it, but I'm not going to spend the time to figure that out because the bandsaw worked so well for me. And second, a hand saw, a back saw, and then a belt sander, you get really good finishes. It just takes a little longer to make those cuts than it does on the bandsaw. So that's the quick tour of my methods, and now we'll do a little bit of finishing. Now when it comes to finishes for something like this, there is, of course, a myriad of options. You could use all kinds of different things. You want to, of course, consider safety, and so you want something that you know is going to be okay for them to have and handle and play with and all that kind of fun stuff. And if a piece breaks off, or whatever weird stuff might happen when kids play with toys, you want to make sure that you don't have to worry about what's on the surface. So it's my understanding that all the finishes that are sold in the United States have to be food safe when dry, but I think the key to that is when dry. Some finishes take a really long time to dry, and I don't really know, if the drying time is 3 months on something, then if for that 3 month period before that, it may not be safe. So I try to go with something that I know is going to be safe even if it's not dry. And that tends to lead me to things like drying oils, like tung oil or walnut oil, things like that, that I know would be okay no matter what. So, for instance, what I'm using here, and this is kind of my go-to finish for most things that I make, just because it's easy and safe and I don't have to worry about it ever, is this is Mahoney's Finishes oil wax finish, and it's a blend of beeswax, carnauba wax, and walnut oil. So I know that walnut oil is of course food safe as long as it's a food safe walnut oil, and this one is. You can make salad dressing with walnut oil. It's pretty common stuff. Beeswax is of course food safe, or at least it can be, and so can carnauba wax because they use it in pastries and things like that. So this particular blend, I don't have any affiliation with these guys or anything. I just really like it. You can make your own oil and wax blend, of course, and I've done that. I've mixed all three of those elements in differing levels. This is just easy, and price wise it's acceptable. So I just buy it pre-mixed because it's easier for me. So anyway, if this is what you're using, you just get a clean cloth and you rub it in, you let it dry for a while, and then you can buff it if you want. And I don't really worry about wearing gloves or anything when I'm doing it because my hands are almost always dry, and a little oil never does them any harm. So anyway, that's my choice of finish. Thought I would take just a second to show you the finished result. Here they all are, and turned out really nice. Some of the best ones, I really like this bird's eye maple. That's pretty slick. And this one, out of what I believe was a cherry burl, is pretty cool. A little spalted ash, kind of neat. So initially I thought it would be important to keep some parallel surfaces on the blocks, and I think probably because I'm giving these to my little guy's going to be 3 here, and it's probably good to have some parallel surfaces because it makes them super easy to stack. So for him that's probably good, and you can do some really nice easy stacking. But probably the most interesting looking blocks are the ones that have the least number of parallel surfaces, because it makes them look more like a piece of wood. So if you get away from some of those parallel surfaces and get kind of funky with your shapes, you get a little bit more interesting, I think. But I think you have to walk the line of what's a appropriate amount of balancing challenge for your little one, or whoever this is intended for, and what's fun to look at or handle, or whatever the case might be. So we will end it there. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.